border villages where people are housed with families, or in sort of suburbs or other rural settings where people are housed with families. So then international agencies have to make sure that the assistance goes out to those non-urban places as well.
I would suggest one thing that really needs to be done very quickly. We were all discussing the destruction of the markets. They really need to be rehabilitated. If people get hooked on food assistance, where does that leave Kyrgyzstan's farmers? And the south of Kyrgyzstan is largely agricultural. So it's very important, because they're expecting a decent harvest this year, to have a place by the fall where the farmers are able to sell their produce back to the populations. If you don't have that, then not only do you have problems having to maintain the urban population, but you have a lack of money in the rural population.
Are there any further comments on that question? Could I ask you, you obviously outlined fairly well the nature of the work that the American Bar Association has been doing, and in multi-ethnic environment to ensure the rule of law, to ingrain the concept of the rule of law, to use the legal system as a way to deal with any possible conflict issues. What do you predict is the future? I know this is asking you to look into looking glass and and do something that may not be quite possible. But what do you hear from on the ground from these projects? Are they continuing? Does this put everything on hold, or how's this working?
The projects are going forward. We have a country director who is Kyrgyz. He's worked with us in our program for 10 years. And we're in constant contact with him. Of course, he is in Bishkek. We do have staff also in Osh. Temporarily, things in Osh have sort of slowed down. But as far as the other projects going forward in Bishkek, they are going forward. And the attorneys working at the Attorneys Training Center in Bishkek are very enthusiastic and very interested in going forward with training on the new Constitution. One of the things that's interesting about our actually concerning about this is that the new Constitution superseded all the previous constitutions, yet the implementing laws and regulations that supported the previous Constitution are still in place. Those laws are going to have to be harmonized, and there are going to have to be new implementation laws passed. There's going to have to be legislation work. There's going to have to be training with the new judges and the new lawyers on these new laws. The people in Kyrgyzstan are going to have training on the new Constitution also, so that they understand how it protects their rights. They will understand how a system of checks and balances can be used.
Yeah, can I follow up with you, Donna, on that particular aspect?
Yes.
The new Constitution, that obviously seems to be almost a dream come true for all attorneys, and and exactly those projects that you've been working with. What can you identify for us key elements that you think should be part of that new Constitution, should be different from the current Constitution, and is that a vehicle to almost from the top strengthen the rule of law, from top to bottom, rather than what in complement maybe to what you've been working on, which is from bottom to top?
Well, of course, looking at our American Constitution, we are a big fan of checks and balances and constitutions. One of the issues that I think that this new Constitution has not addressed fully is the independence of the judiciary as being a check and balance on both the executive and the legislative. I don't think that's been addressed, and that's going to continue to be an issue in Kyrgyzstan. We are working very hard with the judges and lawyers to make them more independent, and that's going to be an ongoing factor.
Is anybody else having any comments on that?
I mean, the big debate over the new Constitution is the transfer of power away from the president. And, on the one hand, those who favor this argue that the presidential system has shown itself to be incapable in Kyrgyzstan because it tends to accrue too much power into too small a circle of people. The interesting question will be, in a country that does not have a great tradition of building coalitions and political compromise, how successful they will be, assuming that there's not a majority party in these elections. And I think that some of the infighting within the interim government does give us pause to wonder how this is going to work out, and I think it will be incumbent on the United States through its assistance programs to try and assist the new parliament and the new government to deal with what is a very new system for them, because Kyrgyzstan has had 2 strikes so far in terms of 2 uprisings, and each government, as Eric pointed out, has been successively weaker, had a successively shorter bench of capable people, and so it's very important to help them get it right this time.
Let me ask you, and maybe this may be one of the last questions, unless we hear very quickly that our members are coming back. In March 2010, the US pledged to help Kyrgyzstan to build an anti-terrorism training center and to help train the Kyrgyz defense and security personnel. Do you know anything about that project? Has that pledge been followed through on, or is that still sort of a notional thing? How would you say the current situation impacts that project, and do we need to reassess this? And third, the situation in the south, and basically what you have described as general lawlessness and mob rule. How concerned should we be that provides opening for all sorts of very militant groups that we're always concerned about when we hear about failed states or a large swath of land that is in essence lawless? Whoever wants to take it.
I can start. I mean, the Counterterrorism Center, as far as I know, is still going forward. In fact, I believe that there was just a Pentagon request for bids that's gone out. So I think it's still very much on track. Your question about the likelihood of a rise of militant groups and in southern Kyrgyzstan, I think that if the government fails to bridge the trust gap that currently exists between the Uzbek community and the authorities, if they drive dissent underground, if they continue, as it looks like they're doing now, to conflate real human rights reporting, like real reporting about the facts as they happened on June 10th to 14th, conflate that with inciting ethnic enmity. I think that there is a chance that that the Uzbek community will become further alienated from Kyrgyz authorities, even more alienated than they already are. And the Kyrgyz authorities already seem, I mean, this is very preliminary, but, and I shouldn't say Kyrgyz authorities because that suggests that it's a national tendency. What is happening in Osh by the Osh authorities? It seems that they view the Uzbek communities with a significant distrust. It's almost as though they see the Uzbek communities as a dangerous fifth column. The conduct of some of this, I mean, it's perfectly legitimate for the Kyrgyz law enforcement and security forces to conduct sweep operations and policing operations. It's legitimate, it's important, and it's necessary. But the way in which those sweep operations and policing operations are taking place in the Uzbek neighborhoods now, in some cases they've been quite violent, and in some cases included human rights violations, beatings, disappearing of property, etc. Seizing people, taking them away without saying where they're taking them and when they're coming back. This is only going to drive a further wedge between the Uzbek community and the Kyrgyz authorities, and that's also a reason why there needs to be an international policing presence, because that way there's a possibility for, first of all, there'll be more monitoring of what's actually happening, more monitoring of the police forces, and hopefully there'll be that will hopefully also put maybe certain constraints on the conduct, on any kind of abusive conduct by Kyrgyz forces, and also it would help to build some kind of confidence on the part of ethnic Uzbeks. Certainly during the Bekiev era and even before, there were the authorities had engaged in kind of a crackdown on Islamist movements in southern Kyrgyzstan, especially on the movement Hizb ut-Tahrir and its members, and on people who generally manifested their belief in Islam and their in ways that were more conservative, more orthodox than is traditional in Central Asia. People who wear headscarves in a certain way, people who pray in certain, in certain ways, people who follow certain imams were the targets of, increasingly, not to the same extent as in Uzbekistan, but increasingly had become, under suspicion. And there had been a number of arrests of people who had been members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. I think so far it's pretty unclear how the recent events is going to have an impact on the development of Islamic movements. I'd be interested to hear what Eric McGlinchey has to say about that.
Islam is one of the few things that's keeping the South together in Kyrgyzstan. And rather than fear Islam, I think the international community would do well to embrace the role that Islam is playing in the South. A lot of what we see as far as Islamic activity, and I say Islamic, not Islamist, is really self-help groups filling the need that the state government isn't filling. So the question about Islamist extremism, I think is legitimate, but at this point overblown, and this issue of Islam as de facto civil society and the de facto security net for both Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, and Islam crosses. One mosque, for example, will cross ethnic divides, is actually a stabilizing force, and something that I know ABA has been working with, I know USAID has been working with as well, in an area that could be a partnership with the United States that could be increased.
I think on a long-term basis that the Islamic community has to continue to be engaged with the civic education programs that we've been doing in the madrasas with USAID funding have been very successful. We've had students say that they realized for the first time that the Quran says that you should obey the laws of the country in which you live. And we had another student say that for the first time they understood the meaning of the word gender and corruption. And they were understanding what it meant to be a responsible Kyrgyz citizen. And they understand that Islam and Kyrgyz citizenship don't have to be exclusive. You can be a good Muslim and a good Kyrgyz citizen at the same time. And I think that that is really vital that we continue to engage that way.
Jeff? Thank you, Donna.
On your first question, I think that it's time for the United States to do an overall review of its security assistance and police assistance to Kyrgyzstan and all of Central Asia. I've talked to people who have been involved, for example, in the anti-drug effort, and who have come to the conclusion that, unfortunately, given the levels of corruption there, much of our assistance has simply led to better qualified narco-traffickers, because in many of the places, the people we're training to combat narco-trafficking are themselves a large part of the problem. I think if you look at the film of April 7th, you will see that some of the snipers on the roof of the White House were in what very much appeared to be U.S. supplied uniforms. So what should be the purpose? What kind of assistance should we provide? I mean, obviously the feeling was if you had better trained police, better able to maintain control through non-lethal means, they wouldn't have to resort to violence. So what failed? Was the training inadequate? Was it the right training? Should more have been done to, for example, increase the pay of policemen rather than providing them with equipment? I think it's time for an overall review of that subject. In terms of Islamism, I think that Kyrgyzstan, like every other authoritarian country in the region, has used the war on terrorism and what they saw as the tacit okay from the United States to pass a number of restrictive laws, including restrictive laws on religion. And I very much hope that the U.S. will press the new Kyrgyz government to put high on its agenda revision of this law, because in many cases I think what you're seeing is repression in these countries is creating the problem rather than combating the problem. It's not to say that there is not a problem there, but I think it is true that